Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, which is called Working with Students Using Switches. Collaboration is Key. It is part 2 of a 2-part series. Last week, we were able to talk about some fundamentals of switch use, the equipment involved, and how we would label it or how we would refer to it, hopefully facilitating collaboration. And today we're going to go further into some of those concepts that can help us work together. So a little bit about my background and how I came to learn about switches. Many of you heard this last week, but just to reiterate that I have had the privilege of working in a lot of collaborative work environments that have caused me to recognize how much I depend on my colleagues to make things happen for students. So this is just a little bit of my background, academics, also working in long-term care with adults, and I have some wonderful colleagues in a communication clinic in Boston who have helped me prepare a lot of these materials today. So last week we started to talk about some concepts, and this week I hope to dig a bit deeper about how we can work together. And before we do that, I'd like to know who is here today. So if you'll take a moment and go ahead and let me know your role, that'd be really helpful in framing the conversation. I'll just give everyone a moment to respond. All right, thank you for your input. It looks like we have a lot of AT specialists and OTs, SLPs, teachers, good mix. We even have some family members and several others. So thank you all for joining us today. I'd also like to hear a little bit more from you before we get started. Some questions that I have for you are on the screen here, and we're going to use the next couple of slides to allow you to give us your input. First of all, I'd like to know whether or not you've used switches before. And if you have, what goals were you addressing, and how did your team work together? So first of all, just a simple yes/no question. Have you been able to use switches and related equipment in your classroom? Great. I'm seeing an overwhelming number of yeses, which is really nice to see. So I know that you are here wanting a little bit more maybe sophisticated information than I might have provided last week. That was meant to be a nice introductory session. So this is good. It seems like we're all in the right place. And I'd like to know what goals you were addressing when you were using switches. This is a short answer that I'm able to view, and I might not be able to share all of the responses during this webinar, but it will help inform future presentations. Once again, I'll just give everyone a moment to reflect and comment. It looks like people use them for cause and effect and for communication, activities of daily living, comprehension, social interaction, just basically participating in the classroom, requesting things. Wonderful. I see a lot of rich responses. So I can see that you already understand that the switches can be used for really functional and meaningful goals. And that is my hope with all of this information that I'm sharing, hopefully going beyond the basics of making something respond to a switch, really digging deeper into what kinds of activities we can be supporting our students in doing. And so now I'd like you to reflect on how well you and your team worked in tandem to support your students to achieve those goals. You know, it's a pretty open-ended question, and it's kind of hard to get at in this webinar format, but I appreciate your input here. I see someone worked together with their OT. Some teams are just getting to know each other. Others do it on the fly. That makes sense. We don't always have time to plan and prepare. And it can really depend on the team members. Sometimes it feels disjointed. Great. And I see some collaboration with, between teachers and SLPs. And so I can see that you've all had, most of you have had opportunities to collaborate, and so you know that there are some, it's how meaningful it is and that there are some real obstacles to it. So today I hope that we'll go into some of those obstacles and how I've tried to address those with the teams that I'm working with in my district. So we're all here because we know that collaborative and creative approaches to switch access can lead to solutions for communication, academics, leisure tasks, ADLs, environmental controls, and more, and that we all hold a piece of the puzzle to make this happen. So I'm referring to the student themselves, the teachers, SLPs, OTs, PTs, family members, and even some AT or AAC specialists. And we all know that the obstacles are very real. So I have framed today's presentation in terms of these 3 obstacles. And you'll see that I've sort of organized the information based on what I think can be some potential solutions. So one obstacle would be a limited understanding of our respective roles among a team. It can be hard to know where the boundaries are between our work, and it can be hard to understand what the other professional is doing. So we'll be adjusting how our skills are complementary. And I will preface this by saying I'm an occupational therapist, so I have I have my own limitation in how I see the team members working together, but I think that the OT piece is really key, so I'll go more into that in a moment. Limited time and space to discuss and try things out is a very real obstacle, and limited understanding of equipment and strategies for implementing that equipment. And these are all significant because, as I said, each team member adds something to understanding the needs of the student and figuring out how to implement a certain system. And having the time and space to collaborate is obviously important because this work is complicated and it takes a lot of trial and error, and that's how we learn. So there are some ways I've learned to combat the limitations of time and space, but I am still human. Oops. And then the technology. I think it's important to consider that limitation because it's really not about knowing every single item that's out there. It's more about knowing the features of it and how you can work with it, what you can do with it. So I'll be using Elsa's story again to talk about some of the strategies that our team has used. And if you'll remember, Elsa was featured in our session last week. She's a great example of how team members have worked together. And in contrast, I just want to kind of paint a picture that maybe it's familiar to you. It's fairly easy to imagine how switches might play into an SLP's intervention, and maybe they're provided already in a classroom. So I'm imagining a student who's been given a single message recording switch that is maybe used during circle time, and that switch could be placed in variable locations around the student, and so that can be a hindrance to developing that motor plan and knowing how to activate it, and so that might be limiting success. And if the student is successful with that single message switch, the team in that case might be wondering, what else can we do? This is pretty limiting just to have one message to be able to communicate. So the focus of the concepts that I'll be covering is moving beyond the one switch and looking at how we develop scanning skills that can be used for communication and academics, etc. So before we go any further, for those of you who weren't able to join us last week, I just want to share that Elsa is a kindergartner with complex communication needs and a complex motor profile, secondary to CP and cortical visual impairment. She's super social and super bright. I was actually with her yesterday, and she was much more interested in hanging out with her peers than talking to me naturally. So I was just reminded of her super social nature. She is obviously at risk for limited participation at school based on this profile. And so her team has been working for years to develop her switch skills, and they have identified a site on her body that she can use to activate the switch. And she's also using a high-tech communication device and is considered an emerging communicator. That's a framework from AAC that has helped our team understand the progression of her skills using that device. And I'll share a little bit more about that framework in a moment. She is in a classroom full of technology. As you can see on the previous slide, these are some of the items. We have toys, we have iPads, different types of recordable switches. She has great positioning supports in her wheelchair and mounting equipment that can put the switch in the right place. And she has a really passionate team of educators working around her who are very collaborative, and a very invested family that is willing to extend the learning goals into the home setting. So the team was working hard last year to develop more options for her to make independent choices and to increase her ability to communicate both functionally and socially. So I'd like to talk about team assessments and interventions. And a little caveat here, I am using Switch Access and AAC kind of interchangeably just because I'm pretty globally referring to the functional goals of being able to make independent choices, whether it's from a device with a vocabulary or a multiple choice application. These two concepts are pretty tied together, so I might use them interchangeably. And I also have had the benefit of learning from folks at Boston Children's Communication Clinic, and this is the crux of what they do. But their work really demonstrates to me the power of collaboration. So last week, we talked about the different players in the school setting. We have teachers developing curriculum and lesson planning, paraeducators who are handling equipment and supporting everyday activities in the classroom. And then we have the therapists, the OTs, PTs, SLPs, and maybe even some specialists who have a little bit more expertise in assistive technology. And they are performing collaborative assessments and intervention, and everyone comes together around the student to make great things happen. So I was telling you how Elsa had been undergoing an AAC assessment in order to obtain her device. And so this language around a functional skill level for someone using AAC really helped our team to understand her skill progression. And we understood last year she was an emerging communicator, and I'd say now she's probably context dependent because she's really effective with her device, which is, I should say, accessed with eye gaze as well as a switch for when that eye gaze is not an option or when she's fatigued. So that is why it's relevant today to today's conversation. And I see her continuing to evolve on this path. So this kind of assessment takes a team approach. We've already reviewed the different players. I didn't mention before the medical doctors or nursing staff, but those sources of information can certainly help and impact how we understand a student's body and motor patterns and things like that, and their vision. During a collaborative assessment, we would need to consider present communication status, physical abilities, seating and positioning, visual, spatial, perceptual abilities and challenges, cognitive and language abilities and challenges, literacy, the ability to use symbols, environmental concerns, and lastly, how to actually implement the system. So there's so much that goes into it. We can't possibly do it alone. But at the core of it, the basic questions that we're seeking answers to are these. What are the child's communication needs or goals? What are their strengths and abilities? What barriers are preventing them from achieving their potential? And what aids and adaptations would best accomplish these goals? So I'll probably continue to go back and forth between slides that might make you feel overwhelmed and slides that hopefully help you begin where you are. And this is such a slide because the switch assessment is an in-depth look at motor, sensory, vision, hearing, cognition, and behavior, because all of these factors impact physical access to computers and devices using switches. During specifically a switch access assessment, some of the things that need to be identified include where the switch will be placed on the body, which is referred to as a switch site, what type of switch will be used, looking at motor patterns that might be activated when the student goes to hit the switch, and movements that are kind of established as ways of moving onto a switch and off and waiting so that the switch isn't hit when it's not intended, and the different technology that can factor into a system and all of the settings that help that technology become customized for the individual student. Here are some examples of switch sites: the hand, head, knee, eye, and foot. And I've heard that it can be wise to start from the top of this list because it is most common for us to use our hands to do things, and each one presents certain pros and cons. And in trying to select a switch site, there are three components. You're looking for a movement that is repeatable and reliable. And like I said earlier, a type of switch that can be activated with that movement. And also, what kinds of mounting options are available to you to make that position functional? A little bit about switch access assessment and how switch sites are selected. And then it may involve, it may call for some intensive intervention to practice using the switch in that way, because we all have motor patterns that are automatic, brushing our teeth, and the goal is for our students to become so automatic with their switches that it's similar. And so this requires a lot of practice and the right equipment and people who are available and willing to set things up and facilitate the training. This pyramid here kind of illustrates what I've been saying so far, that being able to use switches, it's not just about providing it, just making it available doesn't mean it's accessible. It's really important to look at the seating and positioning, the site where the switch is supposed to be activated, what type of switch, how it's mounted, and then you can get to switch use and practicing that skill. So there's a lot that goes into it that people might not always realize. And here's where I think our OTs really shine, because we are specialists in fine motor skills, postural stability, coordination, sensory processing, motor planning, all kinds of things like this that can really help to develop that switch use. And so the OT role, as we came to understand it in our collaborative assessment with ELSA, is to look at that physical access piece. And remember that this physical access is with the goal ultimately of communication and environmental control, academics, and leisure. So it's pretty important. And last week I touched a little bit on these different access methods. I'm going to return to them again in a little bit more detail. Physical access can fall into two categories. For physical access for AAC, and that is direct selection, going right for that choice or directly for the selection, and also indirect, which is when switches come into play. And you would want to first target direct selection because it is much faster to access content that way, you know, a touch screen device or even eye gaze, but it's not always supportive of having the most access to vocabulary or choices. And so when those are limited by the access method, it's important to look then at indirect selection or switch access. And the caveat is that I think we all understand this access method can be extremely empowering and really exciting when it's working. But it is, I recognize that it's challenging. Being able to identify that reliable, functional, non-fatiguing motor response that allows for either direct or indirect access. It's one of the biggest challenges of AAC, and I would say for a lot of our students in just accessing their world. So it's understandable that it feels like kind of a mountain to climb, but it's well worth the climb. So when you're feeling overwhelmed, this set of directions hopefully will help you to begin. Begin with the diagnosis, looking at related motor abilities and challenges, and make observations, just watching how the child moves. Ask parents about the child's movement, or teachers, or maybe your other colleagues who see them in different therapy settings, and then just jump in and be willing to try things out. So hopefully that helps to describe what a collaborative assessment would look like. Now I'd like to talk about some of the strategies that we've used to overcome the limits in finding time to get together and also be in the same place. I work across 32 different schools, and so it's hard to be in the right place at the right time. And so I rely a lot on online collaboration tools. So I'm constantly looking for ways to increase efficiency and also advocating for time to gather and collaborate in person, because this aim is actually consistent with some district goals, and it's just a matter of aligning those goals and then asking the right people to figure out how we can effectively get together and collaborate and perhaps even provide professional development, clock hours, or whatever the case may be, to really make that official and recognized as meaningful work to do together. So this entire training actually came from a two-part series that I planned and executed last year in the district, where we had OTs, PTs, SLPs, teachers, and paraeducators in the same room, which I think is kind of a rare occurrence. And we had them coming from across the district and gave them time to think about how their different roles complement one another, and shared some of these basic terms around using switches that I think have really continued to impact the work that we're doing in a positive way. So can't hurt to ask. And actually we use graphic organizers sometimes, or certain frameworks that helped us also to understand our different perspectives. So another strategy that we would use when we couldn't all be in the same place, now I'm referring more specifically to our team, Elsa's team, we would take pictures and video and share these with permission on online collaboration tools like Google Drive, or you could use Dropbox. those were really helpful in maximizing our efficiency and understanding what the setup would look like. Consultation with people who are maybe at the district level and available to support you. I think that was also, I think my role in the team was very much a kind of bridge builder and getting everyone in the same room and trying to see how we could align our different goals. Cloud-based software, such as the Help Kids Learn software, specifically the Choose It Maker 3 program, which I'll go into later on, that allows us to create activities that target goals, and we're doing that via the cloud. So we have software that we access through a browser, and it is pretty wonderful for a lot of reasons. Implementation tools like lesson planning. I've included a template that was shared by a colleague that I will show you in a moment. And lastly, we have frameworks like the SET framework, which I had used earlier to talk about ELSA. This framework is really wonderful for getting different people together to talk about a student's needs in plain language, because it involves looking at the student, the environment, the tasks they're trying to accomplish, and then lastly, the tools. And there's a lot of different ways that framework can be used, but to me it seems like a nice groundwork for those team meetings, or a nice template for those team meetings. So here's a picture from that training that we were able to have last year. And following the training, I shared slides online so that those who were not able to attend could access them. And information is power, so it may not be as rich as the in-person experience, but it is meaningful to be able to learn that way. I think increasingly in our work settings, a lot of professional development is offered online. And in fact, this webinar is being recorded, and so it can be shared among your colleagues via YouTube after the video is posted. This is another graphic organizer or template that I think might help teams work with students who would benefit from AAC. It's kind of a catch-22 when doing assessment with these students, because the student isn't able to communicate, obviously, and so it's hard to know what's working and how to proceed. And so understanding the nonverbal communications in this way, being able to document it in a grid so that you can share those with your colleagues, it seemed to me like a powerful way to build group knowledge of a student and their communication strategies. Here is the lesson plan template that is available if you click on the hyperlink. It's much longer than it is pictured here, and I like how it breaks it down in terms of where you're getting the equipment and who's responsible for setting it up. And this was generously shared with me by a colleague, Rose Raskow, who's an OT here in Washington. So when planning your lessons, it is important to provide kind of 3 different types of opportunities. Firstly, a judgment-free time that allows students to be exposed to new concepts and ideas without testing competency. Then to provide opportunities for them to participate independently, and that can look a bunch of different ways. And also to provide a time when the activity is pushing them a bit. It's just beyond where they're at, but they can participate with support. And it is in that soup of opportunities, that mix of options, that we can develop more dynamic and transferable skills. And so that obviously takes a lot of collaboration and planning. And so I just wanted to tell you about how Elsa's teacher managed to do this. She had created a station in the classroom that was called 30 Switch Minutes, because Elsa and a peer both were using switches, and this setup is obviously it's a factor in how the the flow in the classroom looks. And so being able to set it up in a station was really helpful. And at the station, I think that they do a mix of fun activities of choice, and they also incorporate these academic apps or activities that, I mean, they might be academic or they might just be teaching a scanning skill. But either way, they're getting that daily opportunity to practice. And it was just so beautiful to see how this was executed in this classroom. So I wanted to share that. When developing the switch scanning skills, this is a framework that really helped me to understand how skills progress. These 4 phases include using the switch for cause and effect. Phase 2 would be errorless scanning, so that any selection would be considered correct. And that might be like making a selection of a musician in an app that plays. For errorless scanning can also be set up in a way that the option that's not intended is just not able to be selected. And so the student has to scan, scan, scan until they get to the one that is designated as correct. So it can look a couple different ways. And then stage 3 would be supported participation scanning, so some facilitation using the switch or switches. And then lastly, independent scanning. And so this is elaborated in this table here, where it also lists the supports and scaffolding, what that might look like, the content that's ideal for each phase, and some examples of activities. And what's important to know about these phases is that you don't actually, they're not static. Our students aren't statically in one phase or another. Those, their skills can really move on this spectrum depending on changes to the technology or the environment or day-to-day. But really, truly, if you're having a student access a AAC device with a number, like a small number of fields of options, then when you enhance that field, it's giving them more vocabulary, and that's a higher cognitive load. And then maybe they're maybe they'd be supported by another setting that, or a shift in expectation as to how they'd be accessing it. So I just, all that to say, it can be dynamic. Does that make sense? And in that, because it's a moving target, I think it's helpful to clarify what are the skills you're actually focusing on in a given activity. And these are some skills that are necessary for AAC. Partner-assisted scanning can be done without any technology using an eye gaze board or a printed core board. And it doesn't usually, it requires skills on the communication partners end of things, but that skill translates over to being able to effectively use switches to scan. We've talked a little bit about the importance, the motor patterns that's impacting the use of switches, and then further, in order to scan, this requires timing skills, the ability to track items as they move across a screen, so watching that cursor as it moves between options, and then the timing of being able to activate the switch at the right time. So here's a list that hopefully can help you decide in a given session what you are targeting. As we are designing academic and AAC supports, it's important to consider quite a few different factors. As I mentioned, the goal of the task, consider the layout and the number of distractors, things that, you know, for instance, if you want a student to select option 2 of 3, your other cells might not have any pictures on them if you're trying to eliminate distractions. Or maybe you include pictures and then it becomes a more complicated task. The settings of the switch control, that can be the scan rate and the appearance of the cursor, or maybe how it is your switch interface is set up to actually interact. So what keystrokes is it sending? Feedback is important. Some devices give auditory previews so that the user can hear some options before they select them, or some programs can have really nice rewards, like animated rewards after a correct selection if it's a multiple choice question. And the motor skill of the student is a big consideration when you're designing these activities. So it is iterative. You know, these are a lot of factors to keep track of, and it's natural that we must try and revise and teach and do it again. It's I like to think of it as setting and resetting using that SET framework. And this list refers to what I was saying earlier about daily opportunities. It's really about balancing the task and the technology and considering what the goal is. So this is just another way of saying the same thing that I had before, that the daily opportunities to do each of these can be so powerful. And I think if you are working really hard and getting at any one of them, you're probably doing okay. So the third obstacle to collaboration was perhaps limited understanding of equipment and how to implement it. And to that, I'd like to suggest that you just focus on what you have available, or if you don't have anything available, you know, there's some wonderful resources. A lot of the content of last week's presentation included links to different products. And it's just that time, hands-on, getting to know it, what it's capable of doing, and don't hesitate to consult resources online. AbleNet has some fantastic user guides that I will talk about a little bit more in a moment. I'm constantly finding new resources that are published by AbleNet, and I'm just really grateful for them. So there's a lot of equipment to get to know, but it really pays off to think about them in terms of their basic nature rather than the brand. To think about what is this really, what are the features here, and what can I make happen using the frameworks and the concepts that we've been talking about so far. So even with one switch, you can do so many different things. You can be addressing social goals with Pictello stories. Pictello is an app from AssistiveWare that allows users to create stories that could be social in nature, like, you know, talking about something they did last weekend and using pictures, and it's very switch friendly, so you could be turning the pages with the switch. You can be addressing academic goals. I've talked quite a bit about this Help Kids Learn from Inclusive TLC, including products like Choose It Maker 3. Those are basically authoring software. They call it authoring, but they're British, so maybe that's a funny word to call it. It's software that allows you to create custom activities that provide multiple choice options. You could be reading books with iBooks or Apple Books and using a recipe, which is actually built into the iOS as a default recipe for that swipe action that would turn a page. And the AbleNet resource of using recipes refers to how to do this. It also describes how you might use custom recipes or custom gestures to play music on the iPad. So the missing user guides that I'm referring to include this new one that's all about accessibility in iOS 13 and iPad iOS. The middle one here is simplifying switch access with recipes. And there's also the possibility of using a mouse on the iPad. But going back to this middle document here with recipes, I was actually just looking at it today, and I was really pleased to see how it described using custom recipes in GarageBand to use Switch Access for music making. And so I thought of a question that came up last week regarding engaging activities for older students that aren't childlike. And I thought that the interface of GarageBand was pretty cool, and I could see that being really popular with some students who fit that bill. So take a look at that resource. It's pretty great. Here is an example of this is an app from Help Kids Learn. Specifically, I'm not sure which this one is, but this would be an example of that errorless scanning where the option or the prompt here is to choose an instrument, and then no matter what they pick, that instrument will animate and play music. And if you really want the student to pick a particular instrument, you could even design this to not accept the activation of the drums or the flute, so that they would learn to navigate to the violin and select that one. So this is, I've referred to the program in the abstract quite a bit, but this is an example of what that screen would look like. And once again, more basically, the Choose It Maker software is very versatile and accessible by switches and touch screens and mouse, eye gaze, and they can be accessed on an iPad or a Chromebook, and they can be great for adapting the curriculum. Many applications for this program, as you can see. So back to this topic of getting to know our equipment, switch interfaces, really speaking in basic descriptive terms, they can be wired or wireless, and each comes with its own set of pros and cons. I'd say grab what you got and get to know it. And then what follows are a few slides that give more specific instructions about pairing Bluetooth devices. Pro tip that I discovered the hard way is that there is a difference between being paired and connected, and that can impact whether or not your devices are are functional when you come back in proximity with your iPad. So I hope these directions just help someone troubleshoot. I don't really want to go too much into them in the interest of time. I spoke a little bit last week about the different settings and options. So now we have a few more minutes left, and I would welcome everyone to take a moment to reflect and think about a student that you have worked with using switches and share what was your role on the team, how did you work within that team, what were the results. It's a pretty open-ended question, but I would love to try and have a discussion here. So for this, we don't have a text box, but go ahead and enter your feedback in the chat box. Thank you. I'm not seeing the chat box myself. This might be my own limitation in knowing how to use this tool. So during this time, I will try and answer some questions that I see. I see someone asked, what are examples of cloud-based software for creating custom activities? So I had described Choose It Maker, but I'm sure there are more out there. Cloud-based software for creating custom activities. When I say cloud-based, I'm thinking of things that are easily accessible without having software installed. And so although this doesn't quite fit the bill, last week we talked about accessing YouTube videos with switches, and perhaps using a recipe, you could allow a student to pursue videos, even academic videos on YouTube. And so you've customized the access method, but maybe not the activity as much. I will have to continue researching it. I've just leaned so heavily on that one, I'll have to admit. Okay, now I see some people who are offering their reflections. Thank you. I see we have an SLP who worked with an AT facilitator. That's wonderful. I'm assuming that person was at the district level, and I know not all districts have someone in that role. So that's great that you had that opportunity and that you found a way to work together. And others are using switches to provide access to the environment and participation. A lot of great input. It's hard for me to navigate quickly. I see someone else as a teacher, and they work with their co-teacher in order to execute a system, perhaps. And some of us are fluid and move between roles, and that is great too, because then we really start to understand where we're each coming from. And I see someone was working specifically on how to use switches to make choices for music. I wish I could read all of these in time to share them with you this way. And thank you. Someone is describing how they served as an OT on the team, and they had an AT specialist do a lot of teaching, but that she helped support the team when the specialist was not there. And so some, models can really vary from place to place. It sounds like that AT specialist might have been doing some direct training with the student. Our model in our district is more that I train the trainers and support them. So it's a little less fun for me because I love seeing kids, but I really love being able to give people the tools and resources to, excel in their work. So there's a lot of different ways to do it well. And somebody was involved in selecting and ordering equipment. So that makes sense. I mean, someone's got to get it in our hands, right? So I'm afraid I'm going to stop sharing these wonderful responses just because it feels a little bit hard to do justice to these great stories in this way. But I appreciate you all sharing, and I'll maybe even follow up with another webinar. So meanwhile, there are some resources that I think are excellent, and I hope you'll consult with them because these concepts that I've discussed really can be their own webinar. And so I suggest checking out some of these different resources. So are there any questions before we finally wrap it up? And I see that someone else was commenting that their role was to find that appropriate and reliable location for switch use, so that near the student's head. And so that's pretty cool. I like hearing how you're able to identify that as being your role and the importance of it. So we do have a few more minutes for questions. I see someone asking about data collection forms for switch use. I don't have forms offhand, but I think Google Forms is a really great tool to create a custom form that can be accessed by any member of the team and then collect the data. Not to just harp on Choose It Maker, but that program does collect data at the end of an activity, and so you can email that to yourself. Kind of nice to keep track of that. And I would recommend using Google Forms. It's pretty versatile.
Amy, there is a question here. Someone is asking if there are resources for teachers and therapists to access equipment for trials with students. And AbleNet does have a product loan program that you can access on our website. But do you have other, and I noticed someone put a note in that Provail has a loan program.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can speak to that in more detail.
I can. Thank you, Deb. So it's true. AbleNet is very willing to lend you equipment so you can try it out. When I worked in long-term care with adults who had progressive neurological conditions, it was a bit maybe unusual to send me a kit, but I was looking at a lot of their specialty switches, and I wanted to figure out what would be the right way for someone with really limited mobility to drive their wheelchair, for instance. So I got a kit sent to me. It was really wonderful to have that opportunity to try things out. And from what I hear just now, it sounds like additional equipment can be borrowed from AbleNet in order to try it out and decide what you would purchase, because that opportunity is so important. And now everyone should know about their state's AT Act program. Many states have taken this funding from the AT Act and created lending libraries. We have one in Washington State called SETC, the Special Ed Tech Center. They have a lending library. We also have another one called WATAP, which is, I think, kind of geared towards folks across the lifespan and not just in school. But both resources are excellent places to check. I did previously live in Massachusetts, and I leaned heavily on our Easter Seals program, which would loan equipment to me. And all of these that I've listed, I can't speak to the specifics, but I believe that they're all funded by this legislation, and it's a really wonderful and important resource to be able to try before you buy. And I can also speak to ProVail, because ProVail is the fabulous clinic that our student Elsa was able to go to here in Seattle, Washington, where she received an AAC assessment and just had this great team of folks working with her. And at ProVail, they have partnered with the University of Washington to create a toy lending library. So they're adapting toys that are off the shelf and adding the parts that are needed in order to be used with a Switch. And I believe they're loaning those out to not only increase access, but maybe even to try toys and see what you might want to buy. So it's a wonderful resource, and I'm glad someone mentioned it, because our student Elsa really benefited from her work at ProVail. So yeah, thanks. That was a great question. I think that's all for today. We're just about at the end. Thank you so much for joining us, and stay in touch.